I knew something was off the second I saw Damien wrinkle his nose at the manila folder on the table like it smelled bad. That folder had been there every Tuesday for 11 years. Always closed, always neatly labeled, always in the same spot. Checklist review, vendor ops. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't digital, it was just Eli's way. And until that day, nobody questioned it. We all just respected it. Maybe not out loud, but we did. But Damien? Damien came in swinging. Private equity slick, fresh off a multi-year stint at some consultancy where they wear sneakers with suits and talk about disruption like it's a virtue. He walked into the finance ops meeting like he was expecting a TED Talk and instead got a crossword puzzle from 1987. He picked up Eli's checklist, flipped through it with 2 fingers like it might bite him, and said, "This is your system?" Eli didn't flinch. He never did. He leaned back, slow as molasses, sipped his room temp coffee, and replied, "It's what keeps payments compliant." No frills, no apology, just fact. That's who Eli was. A 57-year-old finance ops lifer who didn't care about Slack emojis or Q2 vision boards. He cared about what worked. I sat there across the table watching Damien's smirk grow like a rash. I wish I'd said something, but I didn't. Because at that moment, I wasn't sure who the room belonged to anymore. The old guard or the new money. By the way, before we go deeper, if you're listening and haven't subscribed yet, it would mean the world to our team if you tapped that button and gave the story a like. Seriously, 97 out of 100 people don't, and it helps way more than you'd think. All right, back to Eli. You have to understand. Eli wasn't just some pencil pusher hoarding paper like it was wartime. His checklist was the system. No one ever formalized it because it didn't need formalizing. Eli was the continuity. His notes tracked contract cycles, vendor behavior, attestation windows, compliance flags, and all the little bureaucratic landmines that everyone else thought were just noise. He kept them out of legal hot water more times than I can count. Half the vendors only renewed because Eli sent handwritten thank you notes and remembered birthdays. That's the kind of guy he was. Damien, though? Damien saw inefficiency. Redundancy. He started asking questions like, why can't this be automated? And do we even need a validation cycle for payouts if legal's already signed off? It sounded reasonable. If you've never actually worked in a system where a single missing document can stall payroll or void a contract. Within 3 weeks, Damien was streamlining everything. He brought in this third-party tool that promised integrated batch processing, AI-driven vendor management, blah, blah, blah. Looked pretty in the demo. But it didn't know which vendors flagged quarterly legal renewals in California. Didn't catch that one vendor's contract had an attestation clause tied to a physical signature. Didn't care that one of our suppliers only processed invoices through a specific Net 45 flow Eli had been adjusting since 2014. But no one wanted to hear it. Not then. Damien had the floor now. The CEO loved him. Called him fresh blood, said things like, let's be agile, and time to upgrade the legacy. He said that last one while looking right at Eli. The worst part? Eli didn't fight back. He just nodded, packed up his folder, and started shrinking into the background, like he knew it was coming, like he'd seen this movie before. Only thing he said was, be careful what you delete before you understand what it does. Most of us shrugged it off. I didn't. I should have spoken up louder, but I didn't. And when Damien scheduled the all-hands, I had a knot in my gut before I even saw the calendar invite. You could feel the tension in the room. Damien strutted to the mic, flanked by his shiny PowerPoint and 2 white teeth, and started monologuing about legacy inefficiencies and non-essential redundancies. Then he said it. Some processes just belong in a museum, and some people too. The interns laughed. Eli didn't show up. But his desk was already cleared out by then. Just a folded note on top of the folder that read, everything you need is here, if you know how to read it. Damien spotted the checklist like it insulted his mother. We were mid-review in the ops room, heads down in Q3 vendor reporting, when he paused, zeroed in on the folder like it was radioactive, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, wait, this is your system? The room got quiet. I mean real quiet. Even the printer stopped like it knew shit was about to get awkward. Eli didn't flinch. He never did. He sat there, same position he always did. Left leg crossed over right, glasses low on the nose, pen resting behind his ear like he was sketching blueprints for a better world nobody else could see. He looked up at Damien, slow and steady, and said, "It's what keeps payments compliant." That was Eli's version of a flex. Calm, undeniable, like gravity. But Damien scoffed, like actually scoffed. "You're telling me we're managing $22 million in payouts with this?" He tapped the cover with one manicured fingernail like it might give him tetanus. Then he looked around the room like we were all in on some inside joke. "Guys, there are better tools for this. This is like using a flip phone to run a startup." He turned to one of the newer QA analysts, Jess, I think, and said, "What do you think? Should we replace this with an automated vendor compliance suite?" Jess looked like a deer in headlights. She glanced at Eli, then at me, then at her own damn shoes. Didn't say a word. And I can't blame her. Because what Damien didn't understand, what none of them really got, was that checklist wasn't just a tracker. It was a map. A record of who got paid, when, under what clause, how their renewal window lined up with service audits where we were at risk, and who'd been late 3 quarters in a row. It had cross-referenced notes from legal, risk, and ops, all scrawled in shorthand only Eli understood. Some of us tried to learn it, sure, but it was like trying to learn jazz by watching a clock. But Damien didn't care. He just waved his hand like a game show host dismissing a losing contestant. "All right, moving on. Starting Q4, we're switching over to a consolidated third-party system. Everything batch processed. One interface, no more bottlenecks." Eli didn't argue. He didn't even sigh. Just wrote something down in his notebook. Real slow. I saw his pen hesitate for a half second. Just a flicker. Then he uncrossed his legs, flipped to the back of the checklist, and under the final column, notes, he wrote, "Reviewed, rejected, 9/18. And then, I swear to God, he underlined it once. No one noticed, but I did. That meeting ended like they always did, half-baked decisions with confident smiles. But something in the air had shifted. It was like watching the first domino lean, just a hair, ready to fall. On his way out, Damien clapped Eli on the back like they were old buddies and said, "No hard feelings, right? Just bringing us into the 21st century." Eli just looked at him. Didn't nod, didn't smile, just looked. The next day, the checklist was still on the table, but something about it felt heavier, like it knew it had been exiled, and maybe, just maybe, it was waiting. The town hall wasn't supposed to be anything special, just one of those quarterly touch-base things where department heads try to look excited about budgets, and everyone pretends to care about org charts. But this one felt different from the start. Damien had booked the big conference room, the one with the wall-length glass and the overpriced coffee bar no one actually used. He stood at the front like he was preparing for a product launch, sleeves rolled, chin high, voice already tuned to stage mode before half of us had even sat down. I took the seat closest to the side exit. Old habit from years of bad news dressed up as alignment. Eli came in 5 minutes early, as usual, holding nothing but a pen and a folded piece of paper. He didn't sit. He leaned against the back wall, calm, unreadable, like a man who knew the weather report before the storm hit. Damien started with the usual puff. Transformation, efficiency, lean workflows. But then, without warning, he pivoted hard. "Let's talk about legacy processes," he said, with that condescending little pause, like we should all brace for impact. Handwritten notes, outdated checklists, manual validations in a digital age. You know what that gets us? Errors, delays, vendor confusion. What we need is modernization. No one said a word, but a few of the younger analysts shifted in their seats, trying not to smirk. They knew where this was going. Hell, we all did. Damien clicked his clicker and pulled up a slide labeled Operational Bottlenecks. Dead center, a photo, an actual goddamn photo of Eli's checklist, blown up and backlit like it was Exhibit A in a federal trial. "This," Damien said, pacing like a TEDx wannabe, "has been our system for over a decade. One man's handwriting. No backups, no workflows, just intuition. That's not scale. That's a liability." He turned, faced Eli without saying his name, and dropped it. "I don't need your checklist. Clear your desk." You could have heard a paperclip drop. Then, God help me, some intern in the front actually laughed. Not loud, just enough to slice the air. A couple others followed, like nervous hyenas sensing weakness. I saw one guy elbow his buddy and whisper, "About time." Eli didn't react. No raised voice, no defense. He just nodded once, then turned and walked out. But not before walking up to the table, placing the folded piece of paper next to the now infamous checklist, and leaving them both there. He didn't shred it, didn't hide it, just left it sitting in the open like a trap no one noticed. I waited until the room cleared before I walked over. The paper was a note, handwritten, 4 words, use it or don't. The checklist underneath looked the same as always, except one thing. He'd drawn a tiny box in the bottom corner, unchecked, empty, nothing written beside it. But I swear to God, that empty square felt like it was watching the room. Damien carried on like he'd just slain a dragon, talking to legal, updating the board, moving Eli's name off the vendor management chain. But those of us who watched, who'd seen Eli work through late nights and vendor nightmares and contract loopholes no tool could catch, we didn't laugh. We didn't smirk. We just watched that empty checkbox. And somewhere deep in my gut, I felt it start to tick. The first sign was small, barely a blip. One of our mid-tier vendors flagged a non-compliant remittance protocol and paused fulfillment. Damien brushed it off like it was nothing. "They'll get over it," he muttered, barely looking up from his Surface tablet. But by the time lunch hit, the second vendor chimed in, then a third, and then something much uglier. Finance pinged ops to say that the Tier 1 supplier, our infrastructure host, had just halted access to their platform over a contract clause breach. That's when people started actually sweating. The email landed like a brick in everyone's inbox. Access temporarily restricted, pending fulfillment of compliance condition 5B. Attached, a redlined clause pointing directly to a manual attestation requirement, one that had to be physically initialed by the designated finance ops officer. The signature line, still blank. That used to be Eli. Suddenly, the room that had snickered over his retirement age checklist turned into a war room of panicked Slack threads and urgent, need this now subject lines. And that fancy third-party batch tool Damien was so proud of. It didn't even have fields for clause exceptions. It just dumped invoices into an automated approval queue and prayed the vendor's backend could sort it. It couldn't. By 5 p.m., our dev team was working off local backups because the vendor's access keys had been revoked. Contracts stalled. Processing halted. Half the engineering team was just pacing the hall with AirPods and caffeine jitters. And Damien was furious, storming around, snapping at everyone from IT to janitorial like the vending machines had personally betrayed him. When payroll flagged him the next morning, I thought he'd lose it entirely. Validation error, the email read. Tiered account confirmation mismatch for 6 employees. Payment withheld pending secondary sign-off. That was another one of Eli's invisible tricks. Dual-layer verifications for multi-account payments. A safeguard he added after a double payout incident 7 years ago. No one else even knew how it worked because it wasn't in the software. It was in the process. His process, but it wasn't just process anymore. It was absence. Eli's absence. It was the silence in the break room where he used to sit and update the checklist while sipping that sludge he called coffee. It was the hole in the 2 p.m. QA loop where he used to catch the contracts team forgetting to confirm clause renewals. It was the eerie stillness around vendor ops like someone had shut off gravity and forgot to turn it back on. Damien called a floor meeting and blamed IT. He said something about integration gaps and unexpected dependencies. He even tried to rope in the data team demanding real-time dashboards to monitor the fallout. But legal wasn't buying it anymore. They started digging. Quietly, professionally, but with growing edge. I saw 2 of them in a glass room, holding Eli's old checklist, squinting at the abbreviations like they were decoding ancient scripture. One of them tapped her pen on a column labeled RB7D hold. She mouthed the words, risk-based hold, 7 days. I hadn't heard that phrase in years, but Eli used it every single Thursday. That's when I felt it. That sense of deep, structural pain, like a muscle you didn't know you had until it tore. You don't realize how much one person anchors a system until you remove them and the system starts to bleed. Quietly, relentlessly. The freeze wasn't just technical, It was surgical, and Eli, whether anyone wanted to admit it or not, had been the stitch holding the incision closed. They found the checklist on day 2 of the freeze sitting exactly where Eli left it, on the corner of the ops table, under a stapled invoice and a half-empty box of pens no one claimed. It had coffee stains on the edges and a corner dog-eared so perfectly you'd think it came that way from the printer. Only problem was, it read like ancient Greek wrapped in legalese and then translated through Morse code. The interim lead, some poor soul named Trevor from procurement, who looked like he still believed in motivational posters, tried to reverse engineer the framework, which is a fancy way of saying he squinted at Eli's notes until his forehead broke out in hives. Every line had annotations in a mix of shorthand, arrows, and what looked like old punch card formatting. There were columns marked R999D, VL2 host auth, and cryptic little symbols like underlined percentages and circles drawn around vendor initials with dates attached. What does J+5R null mean? Someone finally asked out loud in the war room. Silence. I watched legal, normally so composed, shuffle uncomfortably. They had their own printed version of the checklist, highlighted in orange and pink and riddled with sticky notes. One associate finally sighed, circled a line near the bottom, and read it out loud. Clause 14A, manual attestation by named finance ops officer prior to Q4 payouts. The room went still. Named, not authorized, not designated. That's legal poison. That means specific person, no substitutions. They kept digging and found the clause again, this time cited explicitly in a key enterprise and vendor contract. It referenced something called Appendix D. Naturally, they checked the digital archive. Nothing. Not a file, not a scan. Just an access log with a gap that lined up exactly with Eli's departure. One of the senior legal analysts, Lisa, looked over at me with this half-whispered question. Did he ever mention Appendix D? I nodded slowly. It's not digital. It's a red folder, labeled Appendix D in Sharpie. He kept it in his second drawer, under the tax docs and a Ziploc bag full of paper clips. They looked at me like I'd just admitted I knew where Jimmy Hoffa was buried. By the time they unlocked his drawer, the panic was no longer quiet. It was baked into every Slack thread, every emergency Teams call, every whiteboard with scribbled contingency plans that weren't really plans at all, just prayers with bullet points. Appendix D was real and terrifying. It was a physical binder of side clauses, physical memos, vendor exceptions, manual override procedures, and handwritten sign-offs. Some with coffee stains, others initialed in red ink, one even on the back of a Wendy's napkin. One clause explicitly stated that our largest vendor had the right to pause services if Appendix D's attestation log wasn't completed in wet ink by the named officer before fiscal renewal. You know who the named officer was. And guess what? The last log entry in Appendix D was dated 2 days before Damien's modernization push. The next line? Blank. Empty. Waiting. Damien stopped holding floor meetings, started pacing more than speaking. When he did speak, his voice was lower. Not humbled, just tight, like he was trying to hold the narrative together with dental floss. I watched him eye the checklist one afternoon, just standing there, not touching it. You could see it on his face. He still didn't understand it, but he was starting to understand something far worse. It wasn't about understanding. It was about needing the person who did, and that person wasn't picking up his phone. The board call was scheduled for 9 a.m., but by 8:45 the conference room already felt like a crime scene. Damien had spent the morning in full spin mode, shuffling talking points, wiping smudges off the touchpad with his sleeve, rehearsing phrases like temporary service irregularities and proactive reorganization efforts. He looked like a man about to pitch a failing startup to people who'd already invested. The rest of us? We were just trying not to be in the blast radius. At 9 sharp, the screen lit up. The vendor's CEO, Martin Delane, a man with the kind of voice that made you feel underdressed just hearing it, joined with 2 other senior execs flanking him. Martin was old-school corporate royalty. Navy blazer, crisp shirt, no nonsense. The kind of guy who could stall a merger with a head tilt. The meeting started civil. Damien introduced everyone with too many titles. Tried to steer the conversation toward collaborative re-onboarding, but Martin didn't bite. He went straight in. We're here because your payment system failed to fulfill clause 14A, he said, adjusting his cuff. And more importantly, because our legal team flagged a missing attestation log dating back nearly 3 weeks. Damien smiled, tight, rehearsed. Yes, there was a transition. We moved to a more scalable compliance infrastructure. The prior process was legacy, handwritten, unsecured. The employee responsible had become a bottleneck. This was, in essence, a performance correction. Martin leaned forward. A performance correction. His voice was cool, even. Damien nodded. That's correct. Then came the pause, just long enough to get uncomfortable. Then Martin glanced off screen, muttered something, and came back with a smirk that cut deeper than any yell ever could. You fired the checklist guy? The room went silent. Damien blinked. I'm sorry, Martin said, actually chuckling now. You fired what, exactly? Nobody answered. I watched as the blood drained from Damien's face like someone had pulled the plug. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. We're transitioning to a system. Martin cut him off with a wave. Let me help you out. We've worked with your firm since 2012. Every quarter, we got a physical envelope with a checklist inside, 1 page signed. That piece of paper confirmed you'd met every operational and contractual obligation to protect our data and ensure payout accuracy. That paper was why we kept renewing. He raised his eyebrows. Now we get emails, auto-generated summaries, and 3 days ago my billing ops lead asked, "Where's the checklist?" I told him, "Don't worry, it's coming." He paused again. Apparently it's not. Damien tried to recover, but it was useless. Martin wasn't speaking to him anymore. He was speaking to the board. I don't care what system you're using. What I care about is who signs that paper. That man, Eli Whitman, was the reason we trusted your process. I don't give a damn if he used ink or blood. He delivered. He clicked his mouse, sent over a document, and sat back. Clause 14A, line 7. Continuity attestation shall be provided by the previously designated finance ops officer unless explicitly amended by joint signature between both parties. That amendment never happened. Silence. Real silence. The kind that fills every corner of the room and makes your ears ring. On the far end of the table, the general counsel leaned forward and whispered something to the CEO. The CEO didn't speak. He just stared at Damien. Martin straightened his sleeves. So, can you get him back? Nobody breathed. That was the moment, right there. Not when Eli left, not when the checklist failed, not even when the vendors pulled the plug. This was the moment everything cracked. The shift from embarrassment to accountability. The invisible line between ego and consequence. Damien didn't speak again for the rest of the call. The message wasn't dramatic. No courier envelope, no flurry of boardroom debate, just a single-line email sent from the HR director's personal account at 6:12 a.m., a time that told you everything. Would you consider advising? No subject line, no salutation, just the ellipsis. I don't know where Eli was when he got it. He'd gone quiet after the town hall. No LinkedIn updates, no reply to the 2 texts I sent him. But I imagined him reading that message the way he read everything. Once for content, twice for tone, and a 3rd time just to be sure it was worth his time. They waited. He didn't respond until the next day. 1 email, 5 sentences. I'll consider it under the following terms. No office, no org chart, no title, retainer only, unrestricted authority over vendor compliance. Attached was a single PDF. It was the checklist, but not the checklist. This one was different. Digitized. Titled, Continuity Protocol V2. Still 1 page, still simple. But it had been scanned with a timestamp in the corner and a digital signature across the bottom. 1 line had been added at the top in his handwriting, bold and deliberate. Authority without clarity invites collapse. And under that, 90 checkboxes, all updated, all marked, except the last one. Still blank, still waiting. No fanfare followed. HR didn't make an announcement. The board didn't release a statement. The only proof of Eli's return came through results. Vendors began resuming access, payment confirmations stopped flagging. A quiet message went out from legal. Appendix D has been reattested. Only a few of us even knew he was back. And even fewer understood the deal. He didn't re-enter the building. didn't reclaim his desk, didn't want a nameplate or badge or laptop. He operated from nowhere and everywhere at once. His email address restored, inbox cleared, and a new calendar link that simply read, Whitman, compliance calls. He didn't ask for back pay, didn't demand apologies. He just sent the document, logged in, made his calls, and rebuilt the system around his own shadow. I saw the CEO walk past Damien's office 2 days later, eyes glazed, jaw locked. Damien didn't look up. He just stared at his monitor, scrolling through a dashboard he clearly didn't understand. The same third-party tool now sat under the checklist like a prop in someone else's play. We stopped using the phrase legacy system around that time. Interns stopped laughing. And the checklist? It got a new nickname. They started calling it the protocol. Because Eli wasn't coming back. He was already here. You could feel the shift even before it was announced. It started in small ways, quiet adjustments, subtle habits everyone suddenly adopted without instruction. Vendor ops began blocking off time to review paper protocols. Legal started referring to checklist line items as if they'd always been part of the official policy. Finance added a standing agenda item labeled Protocol Sync. No one questioned it. They didn't need to. Eli's system wasn't just back. It was law now. A formal policy memo went out one Monday morning. Effective immediately, all vendor compliance, payout sequencing, and attestation processes will follow the continuity protocol, V2. It was brief, clinical, no mention of Eli by name, no trace of the chaos that birthed it, but everyone knew. We'd lived through the week without him. We didn't need a name. We needed the damn checklist. IT built an internal portal for it. Not flashy. Just a clean interface with one file, version-controlled, download only. No edits allowed without written justification submitted to legal. Eli was listed as protocol architect in the metadata. No org chart, no headshot. Just one field labeled designated authority external, retainer locked. And Damien? Damien became a ghost in his own department. There was no formal demotion, just a calendar update. He was now assigned to strategic growth initiatives, a role with no team, no projects, and no actual influence. His office stayed the same, but the chairs were removed, replaced with a standing desk and a sad little tray of protein bars he never touched. Every now and then, I'd catch him staring at the internal compliance tracker like he was trying to will himself into relevance again. Nobody visited him. Nobody asked his opinion, because the real cost of ego wasn't the vendors we lost or the outages we survived. It was him. He never apologized, but he didn't argue anymore either, just nodded during meetings and kept his mouth shut while the rest of us quietly followed a checklist he'd once called cute. The next audit came 3 weeks later. External review, full scope, top to bottom evaluation of every payout and vendor validation cycle from the past 2 quarters. Normally, these things were exhausting. Half the office would live off coffee and panic, legal would prep a defensive binder the size of a microwave, and we'd brace for at least one non-compliance flag. Not this time. The inspector, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd built her career tearing apart brittle finance departments, flipped through the protocol, scanned the digital logs, cross-checked every attestation entry against the vendor receipts, and leaned back in her chair with a rare, impressed frown. "Who wrote this?" she asked, tapping the header of the document. "It's airtight." The CEO didn't miss a beat. "A man who writes with a pen," he said. There was no laughter, just that heavy silence of acknowledgement, respect. The inspector nodded once and moved on. No flags, no follow-ups. Final rating, exceeds standard, process integrity noted. I walked past the copy room later that day and saw someone new, fresh out of onboarding, standing there reading a laminated printout of the protocol. Eyes wide, head tilted. She turned to me and said, "Wait, this is real? People used to joke about this." I just smiled. They don't anymore. The celebration was catered. That's how you knew it mattered. Not pizza boxes and grocery store cupcakes. Actual cloth napkins, rented glassware, someone in a blazer pouring sparkling cider like it was Dom. Winning a federal contract wasn't just a feather in the cap, it was an entirely new bird. Multi-year scope, compliance heavy, tons of embedded risk, all the things that scared most firms into passing. But we weren't most firms. Not anymore. The announcement email was short. Just a subject line: award confirmed, FedGov data compliance Tier 1 contract. The body read: thanks to months of groundwork and airtight audit prep, we've secured the deal. There was a line thanking legal, another nodding to vendor ops, and a final one that just said, special recognition to those who built the foundation. No names, no credit rolls, but we all knew who built it. Eli didn't show, not to the toast, not to the CEO's awkward speech about rising from challenge, not to the group photo where someone held up a printed copy of the checklist like it was the company Bible. I don't even think anyone expected him to show. By then, he was less a person than a force. Something stable in the background, unspoken but absolute. His name had become a verb in the department. Did you Eli this yet? Run it through the Eli layer. Make sure it's protocol checked. No one laughed when they said it. That afternoon, a junior analyst, Jaya, barely 6 months in, was cleaning up shared folders after the big upload rush for the compliance logs. She was organizing old backups, clearing duplicates, archiving PDFs, routine stuff, until she clicked into an old nested folder titled Legacy Files Archive, EJW. Inside it, among scanned signatures and cross-referenced clause maps, she found a file simply labeled Continuity P final.pdf. She opened it. It was the checklist. Digitized, clean, familiar, but with one change. At the bottom, under all the line items, clause reviews, risk flags, dual auths, manual holds, physical confirmations, was a new entry. Item 89. Ensure policy outlasts ego. No checkbox beside it, no timestamp. Just the sentence, sitting there like a truth carved in stone. She printed it, slid it into a plastic sleeve, taped it above her desk without saying a word. By the end of the week, 5 other desks had copies too. No one told us to do it. We just did. That was Eli's final signature, not with a flourish, not with applause, but with a quiet instruction that outlived the man himself. Legacy isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself in bold or beg for credit. It leaves a trail that others follow without knowing why. And when someone finally asks, who made this? The answer doesn't matter. What matters is that it works. And that, when ego tried to erase it, the checklist stayed.